Hey everyone, let's talk about the American chestnut. You've probably never seen an American chestnut, at least not one that's fully grown. But only 100 years ago, this enormous tree covered the eastern coast of the United States. People constructed buildings from its smooth, glowing wood. They ate nuts from its tree every fall and winter. Now, the American chestnut has practically disappeared. Scientists are working hard to find a way to save it, but time is running out. The American chestnut, Castanea dentata, stands almost 100 feet with a trunk diameter of 10 feet. That's how big around it is. Its wood is hard and naturally resistant to termites and other pests, making it ideal for buildings and furniture. It is a deciduous tree. Throughout the seasons, the leaves change from the colors of green to orange, yellow, and red, making the mountains look as though they're on fire, and eventually they fall. Chestnuts were common in the United States. They could be found all the way from the northern tip of Maine to the warm southern foothills of Mississippi. In some states, like Pennsylvania, 30% of the hardwood forests were of chestnut trees. The total number of chestnut trees in North America was estimated to be at least 1 billion. Now, there are only a few thousand surviving. Scientists are careful to protect them in hopes that within the tree's gene is the secret to saving the species. What caused the decline of the American chestnut? It all began when travel between the continents was increased in the past hundreds of years. For thousands of years, the chestnut trees in Northern America were isolated. But as modes of transportation improved, people began to trade with other continents more often. Though the North American chestnut trees had been isolated, they weren't the only chestnut trees in the world. There were also European chestnut trees and Asian chestnut trees. Though these trees are all part of the same species, their genes are quite different. This is because they evolved in different habitats, interacting with different species. Even trees within the same habitat have genes that are a tiny bit different. Over time, a process called natural selection occurred. In each habitat, trees faced changes in their environment. The trees that were able to adapt to these changes and survive had different genes from the trees that died off. Over thousands of years, this made the species noticeably different. Asian chestnuts co-evolved with a chestnut called Cryptophaneria parasitica. Ooh. Both Japanese and Chinese chestnut trees are usually able to resist the fungus and are not killed by the infection. But American chestnut trees had not previously been exposed to this fungus and were especially vulnerable. It is thought that the fungus, commonly known as the chestnut blight, was accidentally brought to the United States around 1900. In 1904, the first American chestnut tree sick with the blight was spotted in the Bronx, a borough of New York City. The fungus enters the tree through cuts and grows beneath the bark, eventually killing the tree. The first symptom of the fungus is a small orange-brown area on the tree bark, which then spreads and grows. These spots, called cankers, split the bark of the tree and gradually kill it. Before the American chestnut disappeared, it made up 25% of all hardwood forests in the Appalachians, the main mountain range in the eastern United States. The disappearance of the chestnut tree had several negative consequences for the people in the region. Previously, their houses had been built out of chestnut wood. They had relied on the trees for nuts. They had sold the lumber from the trees to make money to support themselves and their families. Pockets of the American chestnut still survive in the northwestern United States, where the climate is too cold for the fungus to survive. On the East Coast, chestnut trees still sprout, but they typically die while they're still very young and before they've had a chance to produce nuts. The last large group of surviving chestnut trees is in West Salem, Wisconsin. About 2,500 trees exist there, the descendants of trees planted generations ago by a settler named Martin Hicks. For most of the 20th century, these trees escaped the blight, but in 1987, scientists found the fungus among them as well. Scientists are now working hard to save the American chestnut, but it is a long and arduous process. Surviving chestnut trees are rare, and they must be protected from exposure to the fungus. In 2008, government officials in Ohio announced they had found an adult chestnut tree in a marsh. Though the officials had known about the trees for 7 years, they waited to announce its existence because they wanted to protect it. The exact location of the tree remains a secret for its own protection from the fungus. Scientists are trying different approaches to save the American chestnut. Researchers at the American Chestnut Foundation, an organization in western North Carolina, have been crossbreeding the American chestnut with a Chinese chestnut. The goal is to create a tree that has all the characteristics of the American chestnut, but keeps the Chinese chestnut tree's resistance to the blight. Because the Chinese chestnut co-evolved with the fungus, it is not killed by the fungus. Other scientists are attempting to modify American chestnut genes to make them resistant to the fungus. Researchers at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry have inserted genes from wheat into the American chestnut trees. These genes help create an enzyme that kills the fungus. However, genetic modification is highly controversial. The trees that have been genetically modified need approval from the government before they can be planted in the wild. The scientists doing genetic modification defend their work. They point out that there are 45,000 genes in the chestnut tree, and the researchers are adding 1 to 3 additional genes. But whether the genetically modified trees can be grown in the wild comes down to whether government regulators think those added genes are dangerous. Right now, these trees are only permitted to be planted in specific areas where there is no danger of spreading pollen to other non-genetically modified trees. From 2006 to 2012, the researchers planted hundreds of genetically modified chestnut trees in Syracuse, New York. They planted over 150 trees in other New York locations. Each tree begins as a small group of cells grown in a petri dish. It takes 2 years before those cells are large enough to have a seedling that can be planted in the ground. Ultimately, these researchers want to repopulate the hardwood forests of the eastern United States with the American chestnut tree. Chestnuts aren't the only trees from the ancient American forest that have nearly disappeared. Elms have fallen prey to Dutch elm disease, a fungus that devastated native elms in Europe and America. In spite of the fungus's name, it actually originated in Asia, not the Netherlands. The disease was introduced to the United States from Europe in 1930. The disease spread unusually rapidly due to the European elm bark beetle, which spreads the fungus as it feeds on the twigs and bark of elm trees. The white pine tree, native to the northeastern United States, was attacked by another fungus called the blister rust. The first sighting of blister rust occurred in New York in 1906, just 2 years after the first documentation of the chestnut blight. Collaborations between scientists, government, and preservationists may be able to save all these trees and bring back healthy American